Goodbye Eri is one of the three one-shots written by Tatsuki Fujimoto during the hiatus period between parts 1 and 2 of Chainsaw Man. You might not believe me when I say this, but I enjoyed reading Goodbye Eri even more than I did both Chainsaw Man and Fire Punch. It's not just one of my favorite manga, but one of my favorite pieces of fiction in general. Goodbye Eri didn't make me spit out my drink from laughter the way Chainsaw Man did, nor did it make me question the sanity of the author like Fire Punch did. But there is something about it that's so very special to me. In part 1 of Chainsaw Man, Makima said that every so often you'll come across a movie that would change your life. And Goodbye Eri is that for me. So with this video, I want to share why I like this so much, as well as my thoughts, understanding, and analysis of Goodbye Eri. To do this, I will first summarize the story so that those that read it some time ago could get a refresher on what happened in it. Or if you've never read it to begin with, I highly recommend you to stop watching this video and go do that. The story of Goodbye Eri is told entirely through the perspective of a boy named Yuta, or rather the camera of Yuta. On his 12th birthday, Yuta was asked by his ailing mother to film her remaining moments so that he can have something to remember her by when she's gone. So Yuta spent his middle school life filming his mother until her passing. Except he didn't actually catch the moment of her death. Instead, he ran away from the hospital. In his first year of high school, Yuta used the recordings of his mother to make a movie. The film, named Dead Explosion Mother, was shown in front of the whole school during the school festival, and was ridiculed because Yuta decided to randomly add explosions to the end of the film, blowing up his mother and the hospital behind him as he ran away. Aside from just critiquing his work, Yuta's classmates and teachers judged him morally, because what kind of a person disrespects the death of their mother like that? So rather than sympathy for what he went through, Yuta gets contempt. In response, Yuta decided to end his own life. To really guilt-trip those that made fun of him, he filmed a final message for them, and went to jump off the rooftop of the hospital where his mother was treated at. There he meets Eri, another student at his school. She recognized him for his movie because she was the only one who liked it. She stopped his attempt and took him to a nearby abandoned apartment to binge-watch movies. Eri then proposed for Yuta to redeem himself by making another movie for the following year's school festival, one that will make all the students cry their eyes out. So for the next few months, Yuta and Eri study filmmaking together, with Eri acting as an editor for Yuta's scripts and ideas. Yuta eventually decided to do a sequel to Dead Explosion Mother, where he captures his daily life with Eri since their meeting in a documentary-styled movie similar to what he did for his mother. Except here, Eri is a dying vampire, and he must film her death in order to get over the trauma of missing his mother's. As they work on the movie together, Yuta and Eri grew close and fell in love. But it turns out that Yuta's story idea was closer to reality than he realized. Eri was actually terminally ill, and she asked Yuta to film her until her death just like his mother had requested. Initially, Yuta refused because he didn't want to relive the pain of his mother's death. But then he had a conversation with his father who showed him the footage of his mother's final moments, the ones that Yuta was unable to film. And with her final breath, his mother cursed him and his uselessness. It turns out that Yuta's mother wasn't the kind and caring woman his movie portrayed her to be. The purpose of the movie wasn't for Yuta to remember her, but for others to see her courage and resilience against her condition. In reality, she was abusive and narcissistic. She hits and berates her son and relegated him to be an unpaid cameraman. Yuta's father praised him for his ability to bring the best out of someone through his movies, and encouraged him to continue filming Eri, and so he did. The rest of the movie is Yuta and Eri going on dates together as her health deteriorates. The film ends with a conversation between the two in the hospital room where Eri seemed to be in her final moments. When Yuta asked her what kind of movie she wanted this to be, she repeated what she told him during their first meeting, that she wants to make the school bawl their eyes out. The closing line makes the auditorium explode in the chorus of tears, and Yuta holds up a peace sign, finally vindicated in his filmmaking abilities. Now this is where you'd expect the story to end, but it keeps going. After the showing, Yuta is questioned by Eri's friend about the movie, and it turns out that there are actually a lot of discrepancies between the Eri in the movie and the Eri in real life. The real-life Eri wore glasses and retainers and was apparently pretty hard to get along with. And according to Yuta, they never even dated. It was all just for the cameras. So Yuta's movie is a blend of reality and fiction. Much of what was shown to his classmates were made up for the sake of drama and entertainment. This would also be a fitting end to the story, leaving us, the readers, to wonder what was real and what was not, and to think about the authenticity of the media that we ourselves consume. But again, it keeps going. We jump forward years into the future. Over a decade later, a now adult Yuta speaks to the camera, summarizing his life since Eri's death. Despite the resounding success of his movie, Yuta never moved on from it. He felt that something was still missing, so he continued to edit. For the rest of Yuta's life, even though he now has a full-time job and a family, he kept creating new versions of Goodbye Eri. Until one day, he loses his entire family in a car accident. His father, his wife, his daughter. The tragedy is too much for Yuta to handle, and once more, he decides to end his life. This time he'll do it in the place that meant the most to him, the apartment where he and Eri watch movies together in. Upon his return to the apartment, he reunites with Eri, who appears to be physically unchanged from when they first met. Eri is on the couch watching Yuta's movie about her, nonchalant about their reunion, almost as if she was expecting him. She critiques the movie for not having a pinch of fantasy before explaining her survival. According to Eri, she really was an immortal vampire. However, after 200 years of living, your brain would automatically explode from being so big with all the knowledge that it contains. So the previous Eri died, but because of her vampire powers, she resurrected after 3 days, and now a new version of Eri exists without her memories. This Eri is watching Yuta's movie to relive and treasure her previous life. Eri then asks Yuta to leave, and the two say their final goodbyes. As Yuta exits the apartment, he agrees that his movie was indeed missing a pinch of fantasy, and he walks away, with the apartment building exploding behind him. So the story of Goodbye Eri is quite abstract, especially the last 25% of it. But before I lay out my interpretation of what happened, I first want to go over some of the writing and creative choices that I felt were really well done. I think the most innovative thing that Fujimoto did with Goodbye Eri is the paneling. As we mentioned earlier, Goodbye Eri is told entirely through the lens of Yuta's camera. To replicate the feeling of watching a movie, each page is consistently portioned into 4 even rectangular panels. It's stylized like a 4-koma comic strip, which is usually used for gag manga. But rather than writing comedy or self-contained stories with these panels, author Fujimoto used them to depict a first-person point of view for Yuta. These panels also make it so that important reveals and moments have more weight than they would otherwise. The consistent use of the 4-koma panels conditions the readers into a sense of normalcy. So transitioning from a small panel into a full double-page spread deviates from that said normalcy and makes the moment hit that much harder. The readers already implicitly understand the gravity of the scene by just looking at the layout of the panels alone. It's a really clever way to control the pacing of the story, but these panels are also brilliant from a production standpoint. A lot of scenes in Goodbye Eri are very repetitive. Often the camera will stay on the character for long periods of time, with the only changes in the scene being little shifts in their expressions, if any at all. This makes it so that Fujimoto and his team can copy and paste a lot of the art. All they have to do is draw the background and the characters once, and make small changes to the shape of their eyes or mouth here and there. It's an ingenious way to speed up the drawing process while strengthening the pacing and the narrative. Despite being the longest of Fujimoto's one-shots at around 200 pages, I would bet that the manual labor that went into this is less than that of Look Back, which sits at about 75% of Goodbye Eri in terms of length. I also find Goodbye Eri to be the most narratively cohesive out of all of Fujimoto's works. There are many details planted from the start that feels interconnected. You can even point to them as foreshadowing. Some are more obvious than others, like Yuta meeting Eri in a hospital hinting at her illness, or Yuta's mother's request of being filmed suggesting her narcissistic nature. But others are more subtle. In the beginning of the story, one of Yuta's classmates chastised him for disrespecting his mother, telling him that her own mother also passed away a year ago. After the showing of Yuta's second movie, however, it is revealed that she was Eri's only other friend. So while it's never explicitly said, her friendship with Eri likely is a result of her mother's illness, whether because they met at the hospital or because she sympathized with what Eri is going through because of her mother's conditions. Yuta and Eri's dates at the end of her movie also reflect shots of Yuta's mother in Dead Explosion Mother, aquarium, parfait, stray cats. This deliberate choice to parallel his first movie is one of the signs that Yuta and Eri's relationship may not have been as authentic as it seemed. In fact, the true nature of Yuta and Eri's relationship was hinted on the very cover of the manga. On the volume cover of Goodbye Eri, Yuta holds his phone over Eri's face, but instead of filming her, it plays back a prior recording of her, hiding what the real Eri would have looked like. This reinforces the fact that despite everything, we've never once met the real Eri, only a fictional scripted version of her. And speaking of reality, it's time that we talk about what actually happened in Goodbye Eri. To really understand the story of Goodbye Eri, I think there are 4 layers that we have to go over. The first is the self-contained story of Yuta's Goodbye Eri, the movie that he showed to his classmates during the school festival. The second is the reality of the characters. What was actually going on with Yuta and Eri behind the scenes? How much of what we saw was scripted and how much was real? And what happened to Yuta in the epilogue? The third is Yuta's character. We try to figure out Yuta's motivations and mindset. Why did he continue to edit his movie for years after its completion? What was driving him creatively? What did the explosions represent? And what did he mean by a pinch of fantasy? As Eri said, Yuta is the most compelling character of his own film, so this analysis would be incomplete without discussing who Yuta is as a person. And the fourth and final layer is Fujimoto's personal message. Because the one-shots he released since Chainsaw Man have all been a reflection of his own journey and career as a manga artist. So what does Goodbye Eri tell us about Fujimoto himself? We've already broken down the self-contained in-story movie of Goodbye Eri earlier. Yuta makes a movie about his dying mother, Yuta gets made fun of by the school, Yuta meets Eri, Yuta watches and makes movies with Eri, Yuta and Eri falls in love, Eri has a terminal illness and dies. The end. But as we later found out, what was depicted in the movie was quite different from reality. So what was actually going on with Yuta and Eri off camera? One thing that we must keep in mind is that the majority of lines and moments from Yuta's movie were scripted, meaning that Eri did not save Yuta from jumping off of the hospital rooftop. Eri did not just happen to collapse dramatically on the beach. Even her last words were completely rehearsed. The two of them were nowhere as close as we were led to believe, but I'll get to that a bit later. Based on what we can piece together, Eri probably approached Yuta herself after the school festival and pitched for the two of them to make a movie together. She was likely forthcoming about her illness and may have even suggested for them to base the story of their film around it. So the entire process of Yuta coming up with the story idea might have been fabricated as well. But what about the finale? There was definitely a lot more ambiguity in this section, and readers have different ideas on what happened. Some readers took what was shown here at face value, that Eri really was a vampire who returned from death. Others think that everything was Yuta's hallucination. Maybe even that Yuta had died in that apartment and this is what he saw as he entered the afterlife. There are also a group of readers that think that it's still part of the original movie with Yuta's father playing an older version of him. One thing that I'm pretty certain about is that Eri was not actually a vampire. This explanation for her survival is very flimsy, and the idea that she's been waiting in that apartment for Yuta to return since her revival this whole time is very outlandish. Not to mention the unlikeliness of Yuta just happening to be right about Eri being a vampire to begin with. For me, the interpretation of the epilogue that makes the most sense, while still being rooted in reality, is that an older Yuta reused recordings he and Eri had shot in the past. Eri's dialogue here was very non-specific in regards to the current Yuta. Other than acknowledging that he got older, she barely addressed him at all. The two also had no physical contact with one another and only ever shared a single frame with each other, making it seem like their conversation was simply edited together. Most likely, this was filmed to be a potential epilogue to the original Goodbye Eri. It didn't make the cut, either because they didn't have the personnel to play the older Yuta or that the supernatural element was too convoluted. Either way, they decided that it wasn't a suitable ending. This once again brings into question, how much of what we saw was real? Did Yuta actually spend the rest of his life editing Eri's movie? Did Yuta's family really die in a car accident? Did Yuta's wife and daughter even ever exist? While it's possible that he made it up, I think it's more likely that what he said about his life was unfortunately true. Despite the tagline of A Pinch of Fantasy, which we'll also talk more about in a bit, Yuta's movies are based heavily on his personal experience, like how both his mother and Eri really were dying. So I'm more inclined to believe that his fixation with Eri and losing his family were real. So to recap, the actual timeline of Yuta's life probably went something like this. Yuta's mother is diagnosed with a serious illness. Yuta's mother forces him to film her. Yuta's mother dies. Yuta makes Dead Explosion Mother and gets made fun of by the school. Eri approaches Yuta about making another movie, possibly revealing her condition to him at this point and suggesting to center the story around it. Eri dies. Yuta shows the school Goodbye Eri the movie, which is met with praise this time. Yuta then spends the rest of his life secretly editing the movie. Yuta gets married and starts a family. Yuta loses his family in a car accident. Yuta decides to incorporate his tragedy into the epilogue he had once filmed with Eri and finally lets go of his unresolved feelings for her. The end. At least that's my interpretation of it. It is meant to be open-ended, hence the blending of reality and fiction. Earlier, I said that to really understand the story, we have to understand Yuta. And to do that, we'll look at the creative decisions of not just the author Fujimoto, but Yuta the character and the filmmaker. To get into the head of Yuta, I think there are two fundamental questions that needs to be answered. The first is, why did he keep editing Eri's movie? What was it about Eri that he never got over? And the second is, what even is a pinch of fantasy? Again, we've never once met the real Eri throughout the story, only an idealized version of her through Yuta's film. The only thing we know about Eri are from the words of their friend, that Eri was short-tempered, self-centered, and was hard to get along with, which sounds a lot like Yuta's mother. And just like Yuta's mom, it seemed that Eri may have gone into this project for the sake of making herself look good, evidenced by her drastic changes in appearance. In turn, Yuta never got to use his vampire idea, probably because it would be a contradiction to the realistic tone of the rest of the movie. His fantasy took a backseat to the preservation of Eri's image. So the epilogue could really be as simple as that Yuta was upset he didn't get to include his vision, his pinch of fantasy, into the original movie, and decided to insert them years later in the form of the vampire and the explosion. But there is more to it than that, because back to our second question, what does it even mean to have the pinch of fantasy? Yuta's father was the one to describe his creativity as a pinch of fantasy. While Yuta mostly bases art off of reality, he adds a tiny bit of surrealism, often in the form of explosions, but sometimes in other magical things. This was apparently a habit he's had since he was little. And given his mother's personality, Yuta's behavior makes a lot of sense. Neglected and abused children tend to turn to fantasy as a coping mechanism to act as an escape from their trauma and their cruel reality. An adult Yuta later admitted that he's always felt like he's watching his life unfold from someone else's point of view, like he's dissociating. A perpetual cameraman. But to me, Yuta's fantasies are a little strange. I want you guys to take a moment to think about the kind of daydreams that you have. Personally speaking, I would split my own fantasies into two categories: fulfillment fantasy and stories. The first are me imagining myself in different scenarios. What if I did this and that when I was younger? What if I was rich? What if I was a successful YouTuber? The other type of fantasizing are stories that do not involve me at all. I think of stories with grand, interconnected worlds, characters, and history. These fantasies are created for the sake of entertainment and distraction, and most importantly, are far removed from reality. And I assume most of yours are somewhat similar, but Yuta's fantasies aren't that at all. While he adds a vampire or an explosion here and there, his problems are still very present, just under a different skin. Yuta's father and his classmates praised him for his ability to bring the best out of the subjects of his film, and to preserve their memories positively. Yuta's father said that with his movies, he can decide for himself how he will remember someone, but that's not really true. Right before the time skip, the very last thing Yuta saw was his mother's disapproving gaze. Despite everything, he never truly got over her. While through his movies, his viewers leave with idealized impressions of his mother and Eri, Yuta alone bears the burden of reality. He alone remembers the truth. Here's another question. Why did Yuta refuse to film his mother's death? Yuta's character in the movie was supposed to be regretful of missing his mother's final moments, but the real Yuta did not seem guilty at all. In one of the few genuine scenes of this movie, Yuta's teacher yells at him for mocking his mother's passing, to which Yuta responds with indifference. And earlier, Yuta looked like he was trying to convince himself to be sad for his mother. Then, when Yuta was rambling about his story idea to Eri, he sounded unsure about what part of his mother's death actually caused his character's trauma. It seemed what he was saying wasn't at all what he really felt. It was what he thought someone else in this place would have felt. Right before the moment of his mother's passing, Yuta was filming a group of ants taking apart a grasshopper's carcass. While it's a metaphor for dying, it's an exceedingly grotesque way to show it. To Yuta, his mother's demise is about as natural as the decomposition of insects. Yuta's mother gave him plenty of emotions to remember her with, but sadness doesn't seem to be one of them. While Yuta failed to capture his mother's final moments, his father stepped up in his place, and did something that Yuta couldn't, which was to record her for who she truly was, a selfish and toxic person. And this is why I don't think Yuta ever regretted running away. Had he filmed his mother like she demanded, she would have kept up the act to the end, living a lie until her death. Yet despite the nastiness, I think Yuta actually preferred his mother insulting him with her final words rather than it being fake. And this is my thesis for Yuta's character. What he wanted was never a pinch of fantasy, but authenticity. Being around his mother was oppressive. Every movement was calculated, and every error was met with scolding and punishment. The stress he endured from this period of time was probably what caused Yuta's dissociation. Having footage of his mother's nastiness is proof that his suffering was real, proof that he exists. These supposed pinches of fantasy are Yuta's way of processing his true feelings. Using explosions as a visual metaphor for moving on is an interesting creative decision. especially when the thing you're moving on from is the deaths of your loved ones. Explosions are destructive and violent, and to me it's a sign of Yuta's resentment towards his mother and later Eri. His anger towards his mother is self-explanatory, but what did he have against Eri? Eri probably wasn't as controlling to the degree that Yuta's mother was, given that Yuta appeared to have been able to get her to go along with some of his own ideas, like the filming of the epilogue. But while Eri didn't have power over Yuta like a parent would, she was manipulative in a different way. After Eri's death, Yuta revealed that they never actually dated. She rejected him when he asked her out. Their romance was completely scripted. But while Yuta really did have feelings for her, Eri only had eyes for the movie. Now it's possible that Eri turned Yuta down out of consideration for his feelings, that she wouldn't want him to suffer losing someone he loved. But I think that's unlikely. Yuta and Eri's friend agreed that she's a short-tempered, self-centered bitch. And despite Eri and Yuta's characters claiming that they had shots of them kissing, not once did we get to see it. She wasn't even willing to grant him a kiss for the cameras. So chances are that Eri took advantage of Yuta's one-sided love for her to get him to create her dream movie. At least that's how Yuta may have felt. The epilogue initially appeared to be a bittersweet resolution to Yuta and Eri's story. The idealized version of Eri forever remaining in Yuta's memories, cherishing their time together through his movie and pushing for him to move on from the tragedies of his life. But when you think about it, this Eri and her relationship with Yuta start to resemble the one in real life. Despite their reunion, Eri showed very little interest in the older Yuta and shooed him away so that she can continue to watch the movie version of him uninterrupted. In the end, even with Yuta's idealized version of her, Eri only had her sight on the movie and not the real Yuta. And perhaps this is intentional. Perhaps Yuta was finally able to move on by confronting the true nature of his relationship with Eri. But maybe the answer that Yuta found in that room wasn't as cynical as I'm making it out to be. Out of everyone in Yuta's movies, he is the one that was the truest to who he is in real life. So maybe he recognized that while the real Eri didn't love him for who he is, she did love his character in the movie, who was pretty close to the real Yuta, and that was good enough for him. To Yuta, his fantasies are more real than the documentaries that his mother and Eri were trying to produce. What he was chasing for in his endless edits of Goodbye Eri wasn't a pinch of fantasy, but a slice of authenticity. Finally, we have reached the last layer of Goodbye Eri. What was the author Fujimoto trying to say to the readers? Because the other two one-shots Fujimoto published during this time were reflections of his career. Look Back is a symbolism for Fujimoto's struggles on choosing to pursue manga over traditional art, and Just Listen to the Song depicts his feelings on the unexpected success of Chainsaw Man. So what does author Fujimoto tell us about himself with Goodbye Eri? One thing that stood out to me was Yuta's obsessive re-edits of his movie. I feel this is something most of us could relate to, even in our everyday lives. When we realize the flaws and imperfections of our works, we get this uncontrollable urge to go back and make it better. For me, I rarely rewatch any of my videos because I would get overwhelmed with cringe, and then a sense of powerlessness of being unable to do anything about it now that it's already published. I have so many videos that I've written and edited to almost completion, but ended up dropping because of minor errors that bothered me. And for a mangaka like Fujimoto, who is under strict weekly deadlines and pressure from hundreds and thousands of fans, I'm sure this regret applies to him so much more. I want to bring attention to the dates of the video files on Yuta's computer. While describing how much he was editing Eri's movie, the video files shown are dated from January 27th to January 30th of 2018. In the real world, that's only a few days before the release of the final volume of Fujimoto's first series, Fire Punch. Something else that's interesting is that while these video files are presented as Eri's recordings, the same dates are listed for Yuta's footage of his mother earlier. You could see this as a continuity error or another sign that Yuta never actually got over the death of his mother, but from a meta perspective, I think it's more of Fujimoto's lingering feelings towards his first series, and how much of an impact the completion of Fire Punch had on him. But despite all that, I don't think this was the main message that Fujimoto was trying to get across. During my first few reads of Goodbye Eri, I wasn't the biggest fan of the epilogue. I felt that the inclusion of Yuta's tragic and uneventful adult life was unnecessary, and that ending the one-shot with his conversation with Eri's friend would have been the perfect finale. And to a degree, I still feel that way. While the ending gave me a unique sense of melancholy that few other stories have, it did spoil what was a triumphant ending and left most fans confused. The tonal whiplash was a somber slap in the face. Yuta didn't become a globally renowned filmmaker or whatever, he became a loner who lost his family and was obsessed over his junior year of high school. As someone who was rooting for Yuta, the epilogue was underwhelming and unsatisfying. And for the longest time, that was my biggest critique of Goodbye Eri. I felt that the ending wasn't needed and detracts from the overall experience. But upon my last few rereads, something finally clicked. For both of Yuta's films, Dead Explosion Mother and Goodbye Eri, he was insistent on ending them with an explosion. A pinch of fantasy was his justification, even though neither of their inclusion really made any sense in the story. There were no physical explanations for why the explosions happened, and the viewers of Yuta's movie were understandably baffled. As we went over before, the explosions are likely a symbolism for Yuta letting go. So if we were to put Fujimoto in the place of Yuta, each explosion could be a stand-in for each of his series. So here's what I think Fujimoto's message for Goodbye Eri really is. At the time of me writing the script of this video, we are on chapter 192 of Chainsaw Man and most likely approaching the end of part 2 sometime in the near future. And so far, there have been some writing decisions that not every reader would agree with. And just like Yuta with his explosions, Fujimoto has a vision for his ending that might not make sense to or might not be praised by the majority of the audience, but he's intent on going through with it no matter what, staying true to himself with no regrets. Unlike Yuta after the release of Goodbye Eri, or himself after the completion of Fire Punch, this time Fujimoto will not be consumed by thoughts of what he could have done differently. The first chapter of part 2 of Chainsaw Man started with an explosion, and despite what fans might say about the current direction of the story, Fujimoto is determined to end Chainsaw Man the way he wanted to, with a bang, and to never look back.